Since time immemorial, indigenous people have lived, traveled, and traded in the Puget Sound region. The Donation Land Act of 1850, to encourage westward expansion, allowed American settlers to claim these traditional native lands. The explosion of immigration into the region that followed forced the U.S. government into a fraught treaty-making process with local tribes. The original terms of the Medicine Creek Treaty were inadequate and ultimately unaccepted by tribal leaders, resulting in war. The Indigenous Voices podcast is an extension of the award-winning Puget Sound Treaty War Panel series and Fort Nisqually Living History Museum. The podcast advances tribal voices in the telling of Puget Sound history and shares tribal knowledge and expertise with wider audiences. Hello, my name is Warren King George. I'm an enrolled member of the Muckleshoot Indian tribe on my father's side, and on my mother's side, I descend from the Upper Skagit tribe.
Nancy Bullchild, Nisqually Indian tribe, Director of Archives and Tribal Historic Preservation Office, tribal member and tribal elder.
Haslachel, Togalapo, Deisha, Desiyaya Chulup, Brandon Raynon Titsta, Spalapups Chud, Duflalut Debati, Director/THPO. My name is Brandon Raynon. Welcome. I am the Director and THPO for the Puyallup Tribe of Indians. I'm also a Puyallup tribal member.
Haslachel, Takablu Sitsta, Spalapups Chud. Good day. My name is Takablu. I'm from the Puyallup tribe. My English name is Amber Taylor. I am the daughter of Eric Bennett and Carol Taylor, the granddaughter of Ramona Bennett, Clyde Bill, Patricia Taylor, and Al Taylor.
In this episode, participants discuss Article 3 of the Medicine Creek Treaty, securing tribes' right to gather food on their traditional lands, and the legal cases that followed when the article was not honored by the U.S. government. What came to be known as the Fish Wars, or Second Treaty War, ensued as tribes fought for their rights.
Article 3. The right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations is further secured to said Indians in common with all citizens of the territory, and of erecting temporary houses for the purpose of curing, together with the privileges of hunting, gathering roots and berries, and pasturing their horses on open and unclaimed lands, provided, however, that they shall not take shellfish from any beds staked or cultivated by citizens, and that they shall alter all stallions not intended for breeding horses, and shall keep up and confine the latter. Well, I find it I haven't read this in a while, and I find it interesting that they lump together fishing with the breeding of the horses, with the stallions. This is 1854, so I know horses were relatively new to us at that time. Probably only had them in an area for 20, 30 years, so they were still not a main resource, but they must have been coming on strong. And we must have been really good at it because they were trying to limit our access to them. So we must have been using them as a tool that that Governor Stevens and the non-natives were kind of being threatened by. And what I keyed on was that they have to keep the non-breeding horses away from the breeding horses, the stallions. So they don't want any wild horses running around breeding with the non-native horses, which is, again, it's funny to me. But the right of taking fish, and a key on that is, it wasn't, I think we hit on this later in our questions, but it wasn't granted. It was, here it was, the Washington state or territory was saying, hey, the tribes have the right of taking fish at all usual custom grounds and stations. So, not just the Puyallup River for Puyallups, not just the Nisqually River for Nisquallies, not just the White River for Muckleshoots, but all, because we all traveled between each of these, and so we were given, and we went to Gig Harbor, we went to, all the way to, went through Colvis, through all these little passages around it. it was our right to fish in each of these areas. To me, I read that as just, I interpret it as being all of our usual lands as well. So all of our fishing, our village areas, are the places that we were living, and or at this point we used to live, that we were now being forced off of. We could still go to those usual areas, the regular areas where we fished and hunted. We still had access to. So if we had a village at Ording, on Boyd's Creek, like my family did, we were still permitted to go up there and fish and to hunt in those same grounds that we've always had. We weren't limited.
I was just looking in the Omaha, because this was supposed to be done after the Omaha, but I don't see anything referring to the horses. So that's really unusual that they had, for whatever reason, they had put that in there in that section. So yeah, but I didn't see anything in the Omaha treaty.
I wonder if this also stations refers to, you think about the weirs like Yelm Jim had, right? The massive fishing weirs that went from bank to bank of each of these big rivers. I wonder if it's referring to that as well. Like they could still, while they probably recognize that they tore down the weirs, we were still able to go fishing in those same areas.
Yeah. I believe in this article, wasn't this done by Gibbs? Article 3? I think there's history there because it was, like I said, you were supposed to go by the Omaha, but then I thought Gibbs had said, they need to keep their fishing, hunting. So in that sense, I know, didn't he do maps and stuff? So that's why I'm wondering if that's where he came up with this. Still don't know about the horses, but I think the stations part might have been, some kind of his language that he.
Yeah, that's definitely a surveyor word.
Yeah. So.
But they also, like you were saying, Nancy, it's not limited to just hunting and fishing. It's also gathering roots and berries, and so, and this is, as long as it's not on private, so it does outline if it's not privately owned by non-natives, we have access to it. But so you think about all those state lands that we have, today we even have these rights to go out and gather roots, berries, and it's right there. It's our right.
I guess, and like my mind is going to where families fish and hunt and gather and harvest, and it kind of I feel like historically, from what I've been told, families have always had specific places that they would go each year. It's not much different from now, where we continue to gather in specific places, as tribal groups as well. I know all 3 of the Medicine Creek tribes gather in different locations, and so it's not too different from that. But it kind of takes me up to, like, in terms of stations, I'm thinking of, I don't know why it brought me up to like Lummi, where they have like these floating stations where they fish. That's kind of where my mind went. But back in that era when they were writing these treaties, and they knew for a fact that this was something that we would never agree to if it wasn't included. Like, it was our life. That was our life source. That was our way of life. So as they were writing out the treaty, having that foresight, and us as people that didn't necessarily understand fully what was happening at the time, that was something that was very important. Many of these cases I had not personally heard of. So, technically, and it's probably because it's closer to this era, and it was something that affected parents and grandparents, and some of us at the time. But the Bolt decision was the big decision that I feel like has been more widely discussed and talked about, and was such a, I don't really know what it was like in 1905 and 1942 and 1957 for these particular cases, what it was like in the general region, right? So like how was the state responding? How were the, non-native fishermen responding at the time? I know it was like building up to this point where some action had to be taken. I think that tribal people stood on the knowledge that this was a reserved right. This was something that was in the treaty. The treaty is the first law of the land. And so we knew that regardless of what happened and what we went through, that this was guaranteed. So regardless of what the state of Washington thought, what sport fishermen thought, what the canning industry thought, and all of these other folks that were involved at the time, this was a guaranteed reserved right.
Builds on each other. So you have 1905, you have the Winan case. Winan solidified the right for the tribes to fish. First off, it's like, well, yeah, so the tribes have the right to fish. They're reaffirming the Medicine Creek Treaty. That's one of the first ones. Then you have the Thule case, which says, because that guy was arrested for fishing with a net, and that reaffirmed that the tribes don't need licenses to fish. And then, so that was what 1942. So you have that 40 some odd years where we still haven't got that quite figured out. Well, I should say the U.S. government and the state government doesn't have to figure it out. The tribes already, we're just doing, we agreed to it. What are you talking about? Like, we've been doing this for all time, since time immemorial. 1854, you guys said that we could do this. What's your problem? Right? And then, of course, you get the Sataycum case where that's, we have the right to fish in all usual custom areas, which leads to eventually the Bolt decision. But, I think as far as how are they important, it's all leading up to that Bolt decision where we're fighting for sustenance. We're fishing at the time, for the most part, is to live and survive. Everyone who has a problem with this, the non-natives, they're fishing for commercial. They're fishing, so they're seeing us as a threat. For every 100 fish that we catch, that's 100 fish that they can't sell. For them, they're catching fish by the thousands and taking from us. So for every 1,000 fish they're catching is decades of fish that we can't eat. And so I think you have those two different ideologies: one versus survival, one versus survival through work and through income. And so they're constantly battling, and it's all going to culminate here with the Bolt decision. But there's lots of turmoil that is existing in that 70 years for this decade, or for this, for the 20th century anyway, and so it all leads up to that Bolt decision. It's one of the things that they're blaming us for the problem when we're not the problem. It's like, it wasn't just, what was causing, it wasn't just fishing that was causing the decline in fish. It was the pollution. It was all the damage that the non-natives are doing to the sound, to the rivers. But they typical U.S. government and typical non-native of the time, you can't blame themselves. It wasn't their problem. It was the problem of had blamed somebody else at themselves. And so the natives became the natural go-to. They're the next big fishing industry, and so they're the ones causing the problem, not us. Speaking as a non-native.
Well, from just reading a little bit about these legal cases, I'm thinking, a lot of this too was off reservation versus on reservation. So the tribes are going in and fighting for both because this was their usual and accustomed, areas that they fished in, but the state or the government considered it off reservation. So then that leads into your, sportsman fishermen versus tribal fishermen. But also at that time, if you're looking at the time between 1905 and 1957, you're getting back into tribes really didn't have enough legal representation. They were out there trying to do these court cases on their own, with what they could do. So you were constantly battling, as a tribe for both things, the on and the off reservation, because you were having to prove that was in the treaty, that was your fishing station, regardless of somebody else owned it now. So nowadays, we do, and when you go to court, you do have a lot, legal representation, but back then you just have to remember, how do you prove that this was your usual and custom or your fishing station? How do you prove that to these courts or, the non-Indians? Because now a non-Indian owns that property, that area. So it was just that constant battle. And I think, a lot of private landowners who took their claims, they didn't want to hear about, that they would have to give this up or that they would have to share it, not understanding, there was this treaty that gave them the right, which it says in there, that they can go to their usual custom, but it's the same thing, that doesn't mean anything to them. So I think a lot of that built up with the on and off reservation. And so in order to make their cases, then you talk about, sports fishermen, tribal fishermen, all of this stuff. And how do the courts try to separate that, which they really didn't know what to do. So in that era, I think that's where there was all this confusion, which led up to, all the way to the bolt. It was a treaty right. Bolt didn't make any grand decision or grand anything. It was just, it was already there in the treaties, and it was usual and custom. So I think when they did finally get, the tribes got enough legal and enough of these, I guess you would say, consultants that came in and backed the tribes, a lot of them said, that's their right. And these were the places that they fished. These were their usual and custom. These were their shared, all of that to prove that. So then it started to get to where the non-Indians had to prove, you know, that yes, we own this, but we're not understanding that this is their ancestral places, that they fished, hunted, and all of that. So I think that's where that all, just came down to this Volt decision.
I'm pretty sure. I recall even a comment from a lawyer, uh, and they like really. I guess context was a big part of it as well, right? So you also have to understand that these words are and how the words are being used and utilized, and and really my hands go up to the elders who were having this conversation, these details about about this treaty, right, about this document. And even in those days, right, so our leadership uh, were were savvy enough to think about the future generations and some of the issues that we're going to have to deal with. uh, and I they had the the foresight to be able to uh, predict that. Just amazing. And so you know even dealing with learning that this concept about property lines and boundary lines and being able to access some of those areas was addressed is addressed in the treaty document.
And you have to remember what we talk about is um, all tribes are different. So, when you're talking about fishing usual and the custom, I mean, you look at Lilo Falls, they were dip netting and all of that compared to Nisqually River. We weren't doing all of that. So, in that context, a lot of people never took that. So when you look at these cases, it's Yakima, Puyallup, totally different types, ways of fishing on or off reservation, and so when they dammed up that, they put in the dam, what happened to Celilo? It's gone, so there was all these things happening, I think, that tribes were trying to stop, but they were grouping them all together. And I always say that it's not a one size fits all process. And so they thought, if we just do all of this, it'll stop everything, but it didn't, because there was a difference in the way they fished. Because of all this going to court and try to get legal attention that wasn't happening, then when you look at the timeline, you walk right into the fish wars. The fish ins, which drew a lot of attention. And if there was one way to do that, that's what happened. Because that was one way the tribes could at least bring about attention to this that was happening. But that's why, because if you look at those court cases, nothing was happening, and so then you get down to that, the fish ins.
Well, the Court of Claims was the U.S. or the U.S. government finally wanting to listen, I guess, to all the claims that the tribes are saying. You promised us all these things in the treaty, and you're not giving us anything in there. Like, you promised us all this, and now where's your end of the promise? We went to the reservations. We gave up the lands that you told us you would in the treaties if we got all these things in return, and you haven't delivered. And so the Court of Claims was the first opportunity that a lot of the tribes, I know Puyallup, Nisqually, and I believe Muckleshoot too has lots of elders that got to go and testify. And I know for me, it's great information. It tells us a lot about where our villages were, what some of our family relations are, but it outlined all the wrongs that have been occurring and have occurred up to that was a 1927, 6, something like that. 1926, I think, right? And so it was our first voice that we got in as tribal nations to say, hey, what are you going to do about this? I mean, we do eventually get the Reorganization Act, 1934, which is 8 years later. We do get the right to vote eventually around that same time. So I mean, sure, they may have been saying a little concession here and there, but in my opinion, for the bulk of it, not a whole lot came out of that. I mean, there was not even an apology came out of, yeah, you're right, we have not been honoring the treaties. I mean, the U.S. couldn't even do that. It was just like, all right, well, we have these documented. We're going to still arrest you for fishing. We're still going to harass you for fishing. We're not going to do anything to our commercial fishermen. We're going to allow them to do whatever they want to do, but we're still going to regulate you and harass you for doing the same thing. It took until 1988 to get the city of Tacoma to recognize, our federal status. So 1920s was even worse.
It was way worse, Brendan. Right? So our membership, pre-treaty war, it was the state's position that the tribes could only fish on their post-treaty village, their reservation boundary only. That was their interpretation, and that was what their law enforcement and their the state WDFW, that was their position. And they went as far as this is what you saw, all those videos and all those testimonials about what we view as abuse and negligence, and the treaty says one thing, and our treaty was allows those usual and custom areas. It didn't say anything about your brand new reservation, your brand new village, your post-treaty village boundaries. Doesn't mention that at all. It's our usual and custom, our historic and traditional fishing areas. And so, yeah, that was the clash. That was in my opinion, that was what really brought forth this head to head. So this is the way we interpret it, or this is the way our ancestors arranged it. And Brendan, you're absolutely right. You referenced that there was the condition. These fishing rights, these events, and these activities, where they were never ever surrendered. They were never given up. It was never interrupted. It was continuous. It happened. So this was supposed to be seamless, right? These opportunities to exercise the right to feed our people. And so with this traditional food, with these first foods, and so this was a huge problem for our hunters and our fishermen and our gatherers, our plant gatherers, our berry gatherers, and medicine plant gatherers. It was a huge problem. So and the only way we could fix it is and get people to listen to our our needs was to go to war again, like we did the first time.
Warren, it was your dad that I first heard that term, Second Treaty War. So I'd be curious as to if you have any insight as to how he came up with that term.
Where he came up with that phrase or that title, Brandon, is he was a very enthusiastic genealogist, and so he loved reuniting with cousins and distant cousins, and he loved the idea of people discovering their true identity. And I believe in now this in from what I gather, Dad was a huge. Uh, he really favored traditional names and people who deserved traditional names, family names. He was a huge advocate of that and loved the idea of someone from a specific branch or a specific family tree. If they have the blood, if they carry the blood from that ancestor, then they have the right. But there was also protocols, and he was also a big fan of protocols, and believed in the traditional protocols. And so that's where I think this interest in genealogy stemmed from. And then once he learned who these people were, who the ancestors were, he began to make these ties, so these connections of these people who were in fact relatives. It was not an accident that the people involved in the Medicine Creek Treaty War were relatives. They were all blood relatives, or very close, or best friends. It was not an accident. He says that was by design, and that was the way our people were, and that's the way they are today. Family backs family. Family will support family. There's strength in numbers, as that old saying goes. So this is where that term Second Treaty War comes from, because I guess the subject matter or the issue at hand was, do natives really have this access to this much of the resource? And as we all know, absolutely yes, the tribes have a vested interest in these important and I guess identity defying natural resources. That old, you are what you eat. You've heard that before. Well, and we take that a step further. We as Native Americans take that a step further and say, yes, those are our relatives, and we take care of them and watch over them with that mindset. So that's how precious these natural resources are.
The first treaty war, which we consider the treaty war, is exactly that. It was a treaty war. It was over the treaty. Like I keep saying, Leshai said, I'm not against the settlers. I'm against, they're taking the land, this treaty. And I always say the treaty caused all of our problems, from the beginning. So to be a second one, when you go into fishing wars, it's the same thing. Here we are again fighting for something that's in our treaty. Why do we have to fight when you see these other cases that they tried to go to court? They tried to get it taken care of in a different way, and it wasn't working. So then you get the court of claims, which it's like, who invented that? It wasn't the tribes that invent these things. It's the government. And like I keep saying, as they passed the buck, they changed the departments that supposedly governed, the tribes. It went from War Department to all these other departments. They were constantly doing that. They were constantly making these acts. You had the Dawes Act. You had all these acts that affected tribes. It's very rare to see in there that it affected all the non-Indians that should have. This, and so this was just another part of it. You're talking about fishing, hunting, gathering. It's all about how it affected the tribes that already had the treaty right, according to the treaties that were signed. So, all of this stuff with the war, it's just like that. It's go, here we are again. And like Warren says, as you go into the family, it was the same way in the first treaty war. They gathered together because we were all family. And, people will say that, like, well, Leshai wasn't Calip's chief. And I said, no, but when he led, they all followed. I said, all these tribal leaders followed, because they knew what was going to happen. And so then you get back into the fishing wars, it's the same thing. Now the families have to gather again, to defend their treaty right just to fish, hunt, and gather, as opposed to the first treaty when they were taking the land, and same thing, just separating tribes, separating identity. There was just so many ways for destruction of tribes. It's a wonder. Like Brandon always says, we're still here. And I agree. They didn't think we were going to still be here, but it happens. So that's where you get into these wars. It's all because of the treaty. It's all of that. It's right there. It's written.
Of course, I wasn't alive at this time, 42 years old. So I wasn't alive at this time. This predated me, but I have grown up hearing stories from my father, my grandmother, and other folks in the community about who was involved. And a lot of these groups started off really small. And one of the things that my grandma Ramona has always said is that every river, and she, if any of you have ever heard her speak, you probably heard her say something right along these lines. But she said, along every river were Native people, right? So each tribal group was there to protect that river and to protect our brother and sister salmon. And so this was happening everywhere. It wasn't just happening here in the Medicine Creek territories. This was happening all across the state of Washington. This was happening down on the Columbia and Oregon. This was happening all up and down throughout the Pacific Northwest. So there were a lot of folks that were involved. And in fact, here at Puyallup, when the fish camp was set up, and even prior to that, there were movie stars, there were, famous singers that came in support. There was a lot of civil rights and women's rights groups that became heavily involved with this, with the protests and setting up the fish-ins, which were very similar to the civil rights era, what was happening at that time. And some of that was having an effect nationwide, and that was what our people decided to do as well, was have these fish-ins. And there was a lot of supporters, there was a lot of non-supporters. It was definitely a difficult time. I do know at the Puyallup Fish Camp we had a lot of Seattle Women's League, El Centro de la Raza. There was a lot of groups that were up in the Seattle area that came down in support of Puyallup and the fishing rights and things that were happening. I believe the AIM was involved as well. There were some American Indian Movement folks that had also gotten involved.
Black Panthers do, right?
That's an interesting story. My grandma will have to tell that one. Yeah. That's an interesting story, how she ended up in. They were running fish because up here what was happening is the fish buyers were completely under marketing salmon. So when our fishermen would go out and fish and bring them to the buyers, it was like pennies on the dollar. And so what ended up happening here is my grandma would load up her kids and a trailer with fish and pack them with ice and drive them down to San Francisco so that they could sell them in Chinatown so they could make a living. So all the fishermen here would throw their salmon together, and she would drive them down. She'd do a straight drive down and maybe get a couple hours sleep and a straight drive back. She had, back at that time, there was kind of a network. And so she would stop along the way at different places and check in and share information. And that was how information was passed along, was along that drive. But yeah, we were basically being priced out of being able to even sell our salmon to make a living because of the tension and the things that were happening at that time. So she resorted to driving them down to San Francisco. And that was an interesting time as well, because that was during the time that Alcatraz was taken over. So there was a lot of different Native American right movements that were happening at that time. But yeah, she did end up at a party. And she's got some wild stories. But yeah, some of the Black Panthers, and we do have some cool old photos that have been shared around that have some folks from the Black Panther Party, I believe, guarding the front gates of the Puyallup Fish Camp. I mean, we still deal with the fish buyers, right? That's why so many tribes are diversifying and becoming fish buyers for their own communities, because we have these folks that undercut sales and then go and sell them for, for a huge upmarket. It's the same in the gooey duck industry and shellfish industry. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Suquamish and their seafood company, their markets, and they ship them off. But I believe Puyallup is on the way to doing similar things so that we can support our fishermen and our harvesters, because the price gouging is terrible. The gooey duck are really interesting because a lot of them are shipped overseas to Asia. So a lot of them are packed, they bubble wrap them and they can stay alive out of water for a week, and they're a delicacy over there. They're like $100 a plate is what I've always been told. It's a delicacy over there, and so a lot of them get shipped out. $100 a plate is, per gooey duck it's a lot of money.
When they talk about the fish ins, which would be considered fish wars also, it wasn't just the fishermen. It was, the children. It was the wives. Because, at Nisqually, when the men were arrested, the women went out, and went on the river. And so there's videos of all of this, but just as we talked about in other episodes, this is stuff that should be taught in schools, because that's the truth, and that's why a lot of it wasn't addressed, publicly. It's always been the tribes have to bring it up, and then they, people feel like, oh, they're just that, they just want some kind of sympathy or something like that. It's like we're beyond that, but that's the thing with this. The fishermen did what they usually do. My dad was a fisherman, my uncles on the river, but when they couldn't and all of this started happening, the women had to go out. My aunt was one of them that's in the video that's being drug up, on the shore. It's hard to see, but like same thing, was young. But my mom used to say that. She said we would go down and sit, along the river just to support them. But then when it did get violent, the children were involved. So, it's sad that all through our lives as tribal people, we're always dealing with trauma, one way or the other, and that's what I feel a lot of us, on the podcast, on all these panels, presentations, that's kind of what we're trying to get rid of, get over that. So for our younger, and I'm always saying that for our next generation, that they don't have to go through this. But, like a lot of the kids, it's sad that they had to witness this again, after the treaty wars, then it came the fish wars where they had to witness this. And you see them, like I said, on the videos, but it's not ever taught in the schools that this was the reality of it. And, seeing our women, our elders, like that, same thing, to be clubbed, and, the things that were happening to them that people don't want to see, that happened right here, right here in Washington State, you know, right here from all the, the reservations. And so I think that's where I feel, as we're here, we're trying to tell that story. We're trying to get all of this stuff out because you don't want it happening again, but it just seems to happen over and over and over to us, and when you take a stand, then this is what it becomes, instead of saying, they're fighting for their treaty fishing rights. That's not what, people remember. It was like, oh, it was a fish in, or it was a fishing war. And that's not the way it should be. But that's what our history is. And I feel so bad because our younger generation have to, that's their history, and it shouldn't have been that way. So hopefully we change it. Hopefully things get better, that we're keeping an eye on that so that we're making it better for them. But you really don't want history to repeat itself with all this stuff that we're discussing. I'm glad it's going to get out there, but it's really hard to talk about, and it's really hard to repeat. Like I said, I always think that, when we have to tell our history, it's hard to repeat this over and over and over, because it's not, there was nothing good about it except before the treaty. The only good was before the treaty. That was where everything was good. And then after that, it's just been one thing after another. Same thing, whether it was in court, whether it was fishing, no matter what it was, we're still still living it today, so that's how I feel.
Also, thank you to the panelists here. You all nailed it, from your personal testimony and also from your shared stories from your relatives. I think you're spot on, and uh, I'd like to add just a couple of notes or a couple of. I'd like to embellish, or not embellish, but I'd like to share, I guess, some of the sentiment from my perspective here as a historian with Muckleshoot and as a descendant of Upper Skagit. Who is involved? I think that's a great question, and I would love for that question to go to each an individual post treaty village. I think that's to give those warriors credit, those fish warriors credit, give credit where credit is due. There were lots of conflicts that took place in post treaty. Lot A lot of our ancestral people really did go to bat and actually went and did time and gave money from their wallets to pay the fine that they sustained from state authorities or from county authorities. And so my hands go up to those people who were not highlighted, or who were not filmed, or who were not put down in books or journals. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of people who were, I guess, arrested and judged and fined for for attempting to feed their people traditional food. And the crime was that they were taking fish from that was outside the boundaries of a reservation boundary. And so, I would love for Nooksack and Lummi and Swinomish, Stillaguamish, Tulalip, Soxuatl, and Samish. Uh, I would love for these villages and some of the other villages that I'm not naming. There's 27 federally recognized tribes in Washington State, and you'll get a different response every time. I wouldn't feel comfortable moving forward if I wasn't able to acknowledge those people who were also fell victim to this chapter of Washington State's history, concerning the natural resources, concerning not just salmon, but wildlife as well. Also the ones who wanted to gather the berries, the ones who wanted to go dig clams, but had to dump them out because they were considered off reservation or were outside their boundary. Had to put those clams back. I remember the stories, and so. I think that those people really deserve a nod, and they deserve some acknowledgement for standing up for what they were for what they believed in, and sending a message. So those early confrontations I'm saying, back in 1926, when Big John was actually arrested, given a ticket, was brought to court, and the judge fined him $5. In 1926, $5 is quite a bit, and he had to pay that fine and take down his fishing weir on Green River. He had to remove it because the neighbor who was a fisherman complained that Big John was utilizing a technique that was considered illegal. But to Big John, that's the only way he knew how to fish, or one of the ways he knew how to fish. So, I think there's a lot that can be shared. There's a lot that can be learned from opportunities like this podcast to share those histories. And each one of us here at this panel can provide their own testimony, their own experience as well. There are lots of people who deserve acknowledgement and
but just and I think that would be fair. It would be very fair. Um, but I think a lot of credit, I would, just for starters, very first is Big John from Seuss Creek, Jim Moses and Doc Starr and Ernie Purcell, uh, Leonard Buddy Wayne from Puyallup, who lives here still to this day, Herman Moses, and Donald Jerry Sr., and Stanley Moses Jr., and Henry King George, and Walter Allen, Archie Lobahan, Cecil Moses. That's the first list that my late father put together. And that list goes on and on and on until from 1973 to the last one he lists is George Simmons in 1973. This list is very long of people who were considered fish warriors and deserve some sort of acknowledgement, or at least a special asterisk put next to their name because of what they did and what they represented during those times and during this awful chapter of Washington State history. And I love the idea that, I can't remember which one of you said it, but curriculum, right? So I was born in 1965. I survived public school. And I remember a majority of my teachers, my instructors from grade school to middle school to high school. And I remember Mr. Capps. He was my history teacher in middle school. When we talked about Native American history, we talked about Plains history. It wasn't Pacific Northwest history. It wasn't history here that was it should have been focused here. We talked about Oklahoma and Texas, and it was really strange. So I think curriculum, whoever, there were a couple of you on the panel here that brought that up, and I cannot stress that enough. That is key. That's it. That's really important. That'll help our neighbors, our non-native neighbors. That'll help them understand why it is the tribes are so connected to the salmon resource and the deer and elk and hunting opportunities. It'll help them understand why we are so concerned over how these resources are managed. Just so you know, just so the audience is aware, that was just part of it. Being arrested was just part of it. I mean, there was other awful things done and said to tribal people during that chapter. There were threats, and there were even bullets that would fly overhead. You could hear, unfortunately, a lot of our non-veteran fish warrior, or a non-veteran, our servicemen, servicewomen, they probably know what a bullet sounds like, but so do a lot of fishermen know what a bullet sounds like flying overhead, which is super scary. But there's but that's the way it was in those days. I mean, that was how much animosity existed, that another human being was willing to shoot at or towards or very near another human being to send a message over a fish. But at the same time, you can say, well, that's how important it was. Our people were willing to stand there and willing to yeah, go ahead and take your best shot. I'm going to feed my kids.
And kind of to piggyback off of what Warren was saying, and it wasn't just law enforcement, right? There wasn't just an issue, just for the listeners, with the law enforcement at that time. It was the sports fishermen, it was game wardens, it was local police, it was people that didn't want to see Native people fishing, specifically net fishing along rivers.
Oh yeah, and it's still there is overflow from that era. I mean, if we go down to the docks today in October of 2024, I can guarantee you that if we stop a fisherman and ask him, have you had any negative encounters while on the water, or while letting your net soak, or just tied up to your net, or and I can guarantee you they'll have something that they had an experience. And that's just from common people, right? Like Amber said, it's not law enforcement. These are just people who have a grudge. These are people who have a bad taste in their mouth from 1970, 1970, 72, 73. And that it also it carries over. So that attitude from a private citizen carries over to the barge industry, to commerce, to the port of Seattle. Those big, huge barges, Port of Tacoma. So those barges are powerful pieces of machinery, and they can shred a net in a matter of seconds. A $10,000 net just gone because they simply don't like Indians and don't like what they're attempting to do.
I will say that since we opened our pilot museum, right, we have a small section on the Second Treaty War, so the fishing wars, and it's very, very brief section, but it's been really interesting to have various ages of folks come through the museum that either have a little bit of knowledge or specifically older non-native folks that have come through the museum wanting to learn more about the Puyallup people, and having their insight and their recollections. They have a very different way of thinking about that era. And so it's been a really interesting thing to have those discussions and conversations from our perspective of what that was like and kind of what happened and what came from it, right? So how all of these things culminated and where we're at now. And, just there's been a lot of different acceptance, but we do have, like Chris Ehrlich, who is our exhibit designer. She was telling stories about her father, who she grew up in Gig Harbor and can really remember the whole era. So just having all of these discussions about what happened at that era. So there's a lot of work to still do in terms of this particular topic.
Just because there were these conflicts that were very public, right? That doesn't mean that our fishermen gave up. Our fishermen were still active during all of this. So I guarantee you that there was still fish on the table. I guarantee you that the smokehouses were still smoking salmon. So even though Big John's court business was in 1892, he didn't stop fishing after that. They just got more crafty, and so they were really tenacious about the idea of gathering salmon and harvesting salmon as a food source to feed their families. They weren't going to stop, and so they haven't stopped. So I think it's important for the listeners to understand that that even though these fish warriors were being arrested and harassed and clubbed and beaten up and incarcerated, and their gear was being confiscated, their boats and motors and their nets were being confiscated. I think even Big John's spear, his salmon spear and dip net were confiscated and never returned to him. Just because that was all taken doesn't mean that it stopped. There was always an opportunity to fish salmon or to feed the people, and our elders and our fish warriors were going to do that very thing. They were going to feed their people.
Hey Shaba, Hisquo, for joining us for the Indigenous Voices podcast. Indigenous Voices is available wherever you get your podcast. Follow and subscribe at fortnisqually.org.
This podcast is generously supported by the Pierce County Historic Preservation Grant,
as well as representatives from Puyallup Upsh, Discuses Upsh, Squaxin, and Muckleshoot Upsh.
Music by Vincent Johnson, Nooksack, Lummi, and Nishani Johnson, Jamestown, Sklallam, Lummi.